Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Road Diets webinar. My name is Mike Fitch with the Ohio LTAP Center here at ODOT, and we appreciate your participation. As we get started, please take a moment to locate the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel. During the presentation today, please use the questions box to send in any questions you might have. With that, we will go ahead and turn things over to Keith Harrison. Hello.
Thank you, Mike. And hopefully the technology is going to cooperate with me. So let me make sure that I can actually share my screen again. So give me a moment.
Okay. And while you're checking on that, oh, it looks good. Okay.
All right. So hopefully you're all seeing my title slide. And
Yes.
There's my contact information at the bottom. My name is Keith. I'm actually joining you from the San Francisco Bay Area. I work for the FHWA Resource Center, and we are scattered all around the country. Even before pandemic hit, most of us were working full-time from our homes. So that's the case for me here. Right now it's just after 11 o'clock in the morning, California time. And Mike just asked me how the weather is out here, and I told him the high today is supposed to be 101. So if you see me on camera with a ceiling fan buzzing away in the background, that's why. So hopefully I won't melt into a puddle before the hour is out. And with that, I do want to say thank you and welcome to all of you. Hopefully this is the webinar that you had intended to sign up for. Even if it isn't, stick around. I think you will find it interesting. Victoria Beal asked if we might be able to provide some examples of safety countermeasures that could be the basis for a webinar. Some of you may actually have sat through the first in the series of the webinars a couple of days ago, focusing on so-called safety edge. So this is another effort at identifying what we FHWA deem to be important safety countermeasures, and road diet being one of them. And for some reason, my screen keeps wanting to time out here, so give me while I fight with PowerPoint again. So in an hour's time, I'm not going to be able to get too far into the weeds. You know, an hour is to a certain degree both good news and bad news. You don't quite know how much in the weeds to get, but you try to make the best of it. And so with that, I appreciate your indulgence. The other thing I ask your forgiveness for is I've never been a presenter and GoToWebinar before. So if I struggle with things like I am now with the PowerPoint, please bear with me. We'll get through this together. Now, there is a chat function that's available to you. And the one thing I would just kind of pose to you right now, since I don't have a roster, I only have a kind of a vague idea of who's attending, but I certainly don't know what your experience is. So Mike, help me out with this. What I would like to ask of the audience is how many of you have either implemented or attempted to implement a road diet up until now?
So yeah, if you want to type in a yes in the questions box, if your agency has implemented a road diet, feel free to do so. And Keith, the yeses are arriving.
Very good.
So we have about,
how many yeses out of the total audience?
I'd say right now we've got about 20 yeses.
Okay.
And yeah, several more arriving as we speak.
Okay, so for a number of you, and maybe the majority of you, this may be something new, maybe something you've been contemplating but haven't kind of stuck your toe in the water yet. And for some of you, you've had some experience. And certainly I'd invite you to share your experience with others on this call. But what I'm going to try to give you today is a kind of a broad overview. I'm first going to go into just the basic question, because if I were to kind of pose this as a poll, I think we'd get different examples. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen to save some bandwidth here. Is what exactly is a road diet? And once we're past that basic fundamental, I'm going to talk about some reasons you might consider implementing a road diet. Certainly going to focus on the safety characteristics or the safety aspects of road diets and how they contribute to reducing the probability and severity of crashes, particularly for our more vulnerable users. Talk about some safety evaluations, some safety studies that we can point to. I will leave a little bit of time toward the end to share with you just a quick sampling of some case studies, and I'll end with some additional resources so I don't leave you dangling, wondering where you might go next to pursue this if I've piqued your interest enough to actually do that. So let's talk first about what is a road diet, or what are road diets, however you want to phrase that. And what I have here is a definition of a classic road diet. It involves taking an existing 4-lane undivided segment, which is what you see in the before condition on the left, and converting it into a 3-lane segment where the center lane is a 2-way left turn lane, or twiddle as it's sometimes called. Notice also over here, let's see if my laser is going to cooperate with me. Hopefully you're seeing my laser moving around the screen here. Notice that parenthetically here, we have the term roadway reconfiguration. I'll explain why that is in just a moment. And this is really the reason. So if nothing else, do you remember from this presentation today, one of the things that will enhance your ability to try to promote and implement a road diet is call it anything but a road diet. And the reason is what's in the caption at the top here. We all know that a diet is good for us. We're bombarded with ads come January about why we should be going on this diet or that diet. But most of us don't like it. And when it sounds like you're taking something away, we're even more averse to the idea. And you can really set yourself up for failure if you promote something as being a road diet. Now, you can talk about road diets, but use a different label. So the messaging is important, but that's a separate discussion that we can spend a lot of time on, but I want to plant that seed right now. And this is just an example of some of the different labels that some people have considered utilizing, but just kind of keep that in mind as you proceed. So here's an example of a classic road diet. This is from Northern Virginia. And you see the before condition, clearly there was a need for some pavement rehabilitation here. Got a lot of raveling and rutting in the outside lane here. The outside edge doesn't look too good. But notice we have a continuous 4-lane section, just a simple center stripe. In the after condition, we have brand new pavement. We have nice renewed pavement markings. And we now have achieved the road diet by repurposing the cross section in a different way. And having said that, there are many reconfigurations that you might consider, and this is just a sampling. This series of slides actually comes from the Road Diet Info Guide, and I provide a link to that in the slide set. So you can actually go from 4 lanes to 5 lanes. The difference here is, rather than going from the 4 lanes before, you're actually adding an additional lane, the 2-way left turn lane. And in order to do that in the same footprint, the same cross section, the same right of way, what obviously needs to have been done to make it fit is to make those 2 lanes in each direction narrower. And that may or may not be feasible, depend on the characteristics of the traffic mix and all of that. You can sometimes go from a 2-lane to the 3-lane. And this may be a situation where it appears, due to traffic projections or employment trends or what have you, that the 2-lane may suffice for a bit longer, but it looks like the handwriting is on the wall that may be time to maybe widen to a 4-lane section. But what if, even as an interim measure, we added a 3rd lane to try to increase the throughput in those 2 lanes? That's a possibility. Another possibility, and some people look at this and say, wait a minute, there's no diet going on here. Well, yes, there is. What's occurred is that we have this existing cross section here, but we've actually narrowed the 2 outside vehicular lanes to allow some additional space out here. And additional space could be for parking, could be a buffer, it could be for active transportation, what have you. And here's when it's going even more aggressively from 5 lanes down to 3. And not only do they free up some additional space here, but they were actually put in some parking. And now this shows in traditional head-in parking. There's also opportunities here to experiment with using back-in angle parking, which has shown itself to have some additional advantages, which we don't have time to get into here. So what are the common characteristics of most road diets or lane diets, however you want to construe this? You're simply taking the existing footprint, so to speak, and repurposing it or rebalancing the space. So you're essentially taking cross-section, slicing and dicing it in a different way to see what makes sense for the expected users and uses. And what I want to emphasize here is that no single recipe, so to speak, is ideal. It all depends on the context. And so if you kind of approach this as if you're the master chef, but your domain is baking roads, so to speak, there are a lot of ways that you can kind of slice or dice the cross-section. And I intentionally chose this photograph here. This is actually from an open house that was conducted, I think, in Tennessee, where they invited members of the public to come up to this table where they had these little things that look almost like bookmarks, where they could put it into a slotted tray here and show the design staff, if I were the designer, this is how I would allocate the cross-section. And I guess the staff would come out and take a photograph of this, thank the person for their input, and then put these back in the trays. So you can do the same thing, so to speak, in terms of the ingredients, both the types of design elements that you include, as well as the values of the design dimensions that go along with that. So that's what a road diet is, or road reallocation, whatever label resonates with you. So the next obvious question should be, other than, gee, the city next door has one, so we need one too, what are really legitimate reasons that you might consider one? And I think one of the ones that's probably is foremost in the public dialogue now is the idea of complete streets. And complete streets is not a notion that arrived with the Biden administration or with Mayor Pete becoming Secretary Pete. It's something that's been around for quite a number of years. And really, if I were to distill what's all included in this very eloquent definition on the slide here, it's essentially designing a roadway that attempts to integrate and address the needs of all legitimate road users, not simply motor vehicle traffic. The other thing this kind of brings to bear is something else that's in the public dialogue right now. Certainly the pandemic is probably the #1 topic, but I think just improving public health on a more generic basis is important here. And I happened to stumble across this preparing for a different road diet presentation a couple of years ago. This is from New Jersey, northern New Jersey. And so this consortium over here, Partners for Health, North Jersey, Rutgers University, actually did this health impact assessment. And you see here in this quote, as we point out in the study, chronic stress rooted in fears about safety can lead to development and exacerbation of health problems such as anxiety, depression, hypertension, headaches, heart disease, and who knows what else. And as a result of that, they actually came up with this summary table. I'm happy to see that they construed safety as sort of being almost a token, or I mean a de facto health determinant. We would see an increase in safety, a high level impact and high likelihood increase in physical activity. There are also some possible downsides. Road diets are not meant to be a panacea, but you see that if we kind of broaden our thinking beyond just will it serve traffic, level of service, and those things, I think that's where we can become creative and come up with more suitable solutions. And certainly, as I alluded to earlier, the reason that I'm presenting to you today is really more focused on safety specifically, not to minimize the importance of any of the other reasons you might consider road diet, but simply focusing on this because this really has a lot of merit behind it. So if you've heard anything at all about road diets, you may have seen this statistic down here, where for the classic road diet, we might see a reduction from anywhere from 19 to 47% in total crashes. And I'll certainly get into that a little bit more detail later on. The other reason this should be of importance to you is, at least those of you who live and work in Ohio, in Ohio's SHSP, we see that one of the primary targets is to try to reduce fatalities and serious injuries for those non-motorized users. Give it even more leverage here, if you will, or at least weighting in terms of FHWA's perspective on its importance. Back around 2008, FHWA experts came up with what they thought were a list of 9 proven safety countermeasures that maybe were not being implemented as quickly as they might. And so road diets was added to that first list of 9. And today we now have 20, and road diets has remained on that list. So I think that speaks volumes. Also notice that Safety Edge, those of you who sat on the webinar a couple of days ago, was also on this list. And we fast forward back in 2011, FHWA began this effort called Everyday Counts, or EDC for short. We are now in EDC6 cycle. These are 2-year cycles. So in the Everyday Count cycle number 3, road diets was introduced as one of our initiatives. It was a standalone activity. I spent a lot of time traveling the country presenting road diet workshops, mostly day-long or half-day in-person workshops. We had some summits and whatnot. When the next 2-year cycle, EDC4, came around and continued through EDC5, road diets was kind of subsumed under a larger umbrella called STEP, Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian, and it's one of the so-called Spectacular 7. So it's still very much on our radar in terms of something that we are attempting to promote. And so when Victoria Beale invited me to make this presentation, I was happy to oblige. So if I haven't got your attention yet about the importance of safety, hopefully some of these things I'm going to share with you right now may convince you. So I'm going to talk about some of the safety aspects of road diets. So this is getting a little bit into the weeds. And I think you'll find most of these are probably fairly intuitive once you've seen them. So I'm going to talk about reduced conflict points. Remember, any conflict is a possibility of road user error and possible crashes that result from that. Improved sight lines, less difficult crossing maneuvers, both for vehicular and non-vehicular users, and lower and more uniform speeds, particularly important when we talk about the safe system approach, if you're familiar with that. Controlling speeds controls the kinetic energy and the effect on road users when injuries occur from crashes. When we talk about the traditional 4-lane undivided, this is typically what we're dealing with here. The red arrows denote through movements, the blue arrows denote turning movements. And so we first talk about this particular phenomenon here. Picture yourself in the vehicle here, situated in a left-hand lane, maybe waiting to make a left turn onto a side street here. If someone is not paying attention, is coming up behind you, and does not brake in time, that person could end up rear-ended the vehicle, where you are simply left sitting here, unable to move anywhere out of harm's way because of the way this is designed. And it can become even more daunting if you're having to make a turn and look for gaps in 2 lanes of oncoming traffic. And we know from anecdotal evidence and from research that particularly for the older driver can get far more easily intimidated and may make a rush decision and maybe turn where there's an inadequate gap. So much so that a number of entities like AARP actually suggest that for older drivers, that given the opportunity, it might make sense to make 3 right turns and avoid having to make a left turn at an intersection to begin with, because of what we see as a disturbing crash pattern here. So what I'm going to show you now is an animation, and I will apologize in advance. This is an animation that was prepared in the PowerPoint version in the 4.3 or standard format. What you're seeing on your screen right now is the 16:9 or the landscape or enhanced format, what have you. The animation worked perfectly in the 4.3. What you're going to see here, there are things that are broken, so just bear with me if things don't line up. Apparently the coordinates and the touch points didn't translate well in the 16:9 aspect ratio. So with that, hopefully what you're going to see here is an animation. So the driver in the blue car is waiting patiently to make a left turn, waiting for a gap, and the person in the yellow car was not paying attention and ended up in a rear-end crash. And that can be a fairly severe crash, not anything that any of us want to do. On the right-hand side, where there is a continuous 2F turn lane, presumably this is a classic road diet that's been implemented. We have here is the driver in the car. Ignore the turn signal being on the wrong side here. Now has a place of safe refuge to wait for a gap in traffic, and that yellow car drove by oblivious to the situation. The other thing that we observe in a situation like this is that drivers, being impatient, tend to apply the brake by turning the steering wheel, meaning they would rather dive out of the lane than have the brake. And when they do that, something like you see on the left-hand side here can occur. The side swipe or a partial rear-end type crash can result from those types of behavior. So again, here's an animation. And this simply shows a situation where a driver, whether impaired or distracted, might actually drift across the center line. Now, this is technically a roadway departure crash. Many of us think about roadway departures, run off the road, but this technically meets the definition. Certainly, it's not something any of us would want to be involved in. With the road diet, if that same phenomenon occurs, it's far more forgiving. Now, we are assuming the two left turn lane is completely empty at that time. Yes, there's some simplicity to that graphic, but it gives us a bit more real estate, if you will, to correct our misdeeds, so to speak. The other thing where this can provide some benefit is in providing access to EMS. Remember the 4 E's, and this one certainly is very important. And so on the left-hand side here, we have a graphic that shows the fire truck is probably doing its best, blowing the horn and the siren, trying to wend its way through traffic where drivers are trying to squeeze out of the way and having limited success. Here, with the two-way left turn lane, again, assuming it is mostly empty, the fire truck has easier access. So let's now talk about improved sight lines. And so we have depicted on the screen here, again, the before and the after condition. If this driver is paused here, waiting to make a left turn, in addition to concerns we have about him being rear-ended, he's also having to contend with making a judgment call about when he or she might be able to turn left. And right now, albeit for only a split second, this vehicle here in the near lane is blocking the line of sight to the vehicle behind. So the driver here may be saying to him or herself, you know what, this vehicle is about to clear. Let me take the foot off the brake, begin to accelerate, turn left before realizing this vehicle is in the outside lane and a crash may occur. Look on the right-hand side here, and again, the driver is in their own kind of protected space here, able to wait for a gap in oncoming traffic, and in this case, only one lane of oncoming traffic. Again, here's an animation meant to depict how this might occur. Again, there's the cone of vision partly blocked, and the same is true for the opposing vehicle, each one wanting to make a left turn in the other direction. Yeah, and in this case, their cone of vision is for the most part uninterrupted. Same phenomenon can occur when a vehicle is trying to turn onto the main roadway from a side street or even from a driveway, a commercial driveway perhaps. The cone of vision is interrupted by this near vehicle, or vehicle in the near lane, I should say, which may, depending on the timing, block the view of a vehicle on the outside. Again, this driver may be thinking, once this vehicle clears my path, I'm going to gun it and come out here and end up getting broadside. Where we have just the one lane of traffic, we have vehicles tuning one behind the other, and the line of sight issue is pretty much resolved itself. So that's a situation which is more focused here on interaction with the non-motorized or more vulnerable user. This is probably not an atypical situation. It's not always going to be a bus here. It could be another car or a truck. But the situation is that a pedestrian stepping out into the marked crosswalk, or even if it is not a marked crosswalk, may not be able to see oncoming traffic in this outermost lane. And the same is true for the driver's ability to see pedestrian traffic here. And if they are not able to see and react to one another until the very end, then we may have a very horrific crash that occurs. So one of the things that I taught my daughters when they learn to drive is don't assume because somebody is stopping ahead of you, it's not obvious to you why they're stopping and whip around them. There's probably a reason for stopping, so be very cautious before you do anything like that. Let me just pause here, make sure that I haven't missed any questions or comments that may have popped up in the chat pod. Mike, anything that I should be addressing right now?
Hi, Keith. We do not have any questions at this time, but we do invite the attendees to submit any questions they might have. Oh, wait, here we go. We have a question from Jeff. Why doesn't the FHWA information booklet show a graphic which shows a road diet reconfiguration with a TWLTL, 2 through lanes in one direction and 1 lane in the opposite direction? The FHWA publication says the primary purpose of a road diet is to install the TWLTL. This can be implemented simply by striping over 3 of the existing stripes and only having to remove part of the 4th stripe. This can be done in just a couple of days by a striping contractor. It also better maintains gaps in traffic instead of compressing the traffic stream and reducing gaps to turn into or through.
Oh, first of all, compliments a very well thought out question. Short answer is, when the Road Diet Info Guide was published back around 2017, I think the attempt was not to address all the possible flavors of road diet that might exist. In fact, the 4 that I showed you on that slide, building over 4 slides, was just not a random sample, but just a sampling. And again, there are all sorts of options. I think I recall seeing a presentation done by Randy Dittner from Virginia DOT that actually cited an example of what you were describing there. And one thing I do want to emphasize, which you mentioned in your question, in a lot of situations, you can do a lot of these changes in concert with a planned resurfacing. In fact, some DOTs have been very creative, and they've actually done this in sort of a staged way. So they would go on the so-called leveling course, if we're talking about bituminous pavement, and lay down the temporary striping, open it to traffic, see how traffic reacts, see how the local community reacts, and if there's a huge pushback, it's just a matter of restriping. If there's not, I think we'll put down the final striping. So again, the Road Diet Info Guide does not cover all the possible scenarios, but I appreciate you bringing up that other option. Any other questions?
Nope, thanks, Keith.
All right, so let me go ahead here. We can resume here, talking about crossing maneuvers and trying to make them less difficult. And again, the easier we make it for road users to negotiate our roadways, the higher likelihood of being successful in doing that. So this is a graphic from the Human Factors Guidelines NC HRP Report 600, which I highly recommend that you have a look at. And so don't be concerned about the lag and the gap in any particular definition, but you can see here that a driver turning from the side road has to first look for opportunities to move across the 2 near lanes, but also be mindful that once they cross that center stripe, they're potentially vulnerable to vehicles coming from their right. So how does a road diet, classic road diet, address that? Well, the woman here you see is pulling out from the driveway or the side road. She's actually already crept out into the near lane, maybe not even aware that she's done that, and trying to address those gaps. With the 2-way left turn lane, that driver could, whether it's technically legal or not, depending on the state jurisdiction, typically by custom, if you will, drivers can pause in the 2-way left turn lane and then wait to move over into the opposing lane of traffic to continue that left turn. For the pedestrian, particularly for the older pedestrian, making those crossing maneuvers less difficult certainly enhances the likelihood that they will be able to do that successfully. Photograph on the right, if you're curious, actually comes from someplace near Las Vegas. I've lost count of how many through lanes are out there. This person probably is out there early morning before the traffic has really picked up. But you see the photograph on the left here. This woman is already intimidated about even setting foot onto the roadway here. Don't know whether she could even see the ped head on the far side, and if she has, whether she actually understands what it's saying to her. She's already kind of self-imposed on her an additional startup delay here, being back from the edge of the roadway, and that's not a very inviting start there. It looks like almost a valley gutter and a depression in front of her. So we've done our best here, or these 2 situations are examples of extreme cases of we've almost being hostile to pedestrians. this is a far better scenario where we actually thought through trying to balance the needs of all users by providing this pedestrian refuge. And this is not maybe the most exact example here, but this is a situation where it actually has introduced this need to change direction a little bit, and it actually forces pedestrians to look toward oncoming traffic before they complete their travel here. So what this does, for the most part, the benefit we're accruing is the total pedestrian crossing is broken up into 2 stages. So not only is it allowing the pedestrian to have to look for traffic only one direction at a time, but it also reduces their total exposure to live traffic. Those are both good things. I think we all know that so-called non-motorized or vulnerable users, when they are involved in a crash with a motor vehicle, are almost always going to come out on the losing end. And as speeds increase, the risk that those injuries become more severe and become fatal are very, very troubling here. At 32 miles per hour, there's already a 25% risk of a fatality. At just about 10 miles per hour higher than that, we're at 50%. So the whole idea about trying to control traffic and minimize exposure for the pedestrians is important here. So one of the side benefits of a classic road diet, where you have one through lane in each direction, is that the lead car, assuming that driver is a prudent driver, and hopefully Ohio does have a few prudent drivers. I think there's a few prudent drivers around here. That first driver essentially becomes the pace car. And so however fast or slow that lead driver is traveling necessarily controls the speed behind. And that's a good thing as well. So this is a graphic I found in the city of Hoboken, New Jersey. And notice I've used this phrase 20 is plenty. I think the UK actually has been using that for quite a number of years. And here's another example of a graphic that's trying to emphasize the impact in terms of likelihood of a fatality for pedestrians here. A little bit bonus here, again, since we only have an hour to share, I've not had time, won't have time, I should say, to go through all the aspects of road diets and things that you need to be thinking about in terms of their feasibility. Again, this is not a situation where I'm trying to sell you on road diets. Certainly, I'm not trying to sell you that they're a panacea. They do have their place. One of those potential constraints is volume thresholds. But a general rule of thumb that we have used is about 20,000 or less. There's probably a fairly good likelihood that road diet can be successful. You see the graphic that I've pasted here on the left-hand side of the slide shows some varying guidelines based upon individual cities: Pasadena, Lansing, Michigan, Seattle, Washington. But what I want to bring your attention to here is the opportunity to introduce single-lane roundabouts in concert with a road diet. Because when you think about capacity restrictions on a road diet, I think most of us would recognize that it's not the segment itself that's controlling. Like anything else, it's most often the intersection, how the intersection is built, how do the intersections controlled. And roundabouts can work nicely. And you see here, this is an excerpt from the NCAA report 672 on roundabouts. And it shows that up to around 18,000 or so, and it's even as left turn percentages from the roadway increase, a single lane roundabout probably can be compatible. So something like this can probably be an option for you. Apologize for the poor quality of the photograph on the right. But this is why I highlight roundabouts, because roundabouts themselves have significant benefits in terms of safety, particularly the severe crashes, going from stop controlled, 82% reduction, signalized controls, 78%, 80% on average. That is huge in the context of safety performance. So let's talk just a little bit more about some safety studies that have been done. I think a lot of us would prefer that we had far more robust safety studies than maybe exist, but we certainly do want to take credit for those that have been done for us. So the first one I want to share with you is the one that you saw earlier, and I have it repeated here. And that is the idea that you might have anywhere from 19 to 47% reduction in total crashes. That number fall out of the sky, where there's some basis for that. Well, certainly there was some basis for that. And in fact, it's the first study that's referenced in Appendix A in that road diet info guide. And the accompanying narrative says, and I've quoted on the screen here, this is, at least as of 2017 or so, arguably the strongest crash-based evaluation of a road diet implementation. And it comes from this document over here, so-called HSIS summary report. HSIS is a group of about 8 or 9 states from whom there are crash databases that are fairly complex, complete, robust, reliable, that a lot of researchers will glean data from and do whatever research that they're wanting to do. And so this is the source for the study that went on here. And specifically, they looked at road diets that were implemented in the state of Iowa, as well as in a couple of urban locations or suburban locations in California and Washington. I believe in California, it was in the San Francisco and San Jose area. I believe up in Washington, it's probably in and around Seattle. But what it shows here, and all I wanted to point out from this particular slide, is they identified 15 sites where a road diet was implemented in Iowa, compared those to almost 300 sites, control sites, if you will. I don't know why they call it HSIS. What they're referring to here are the California and Washington experience. So there were 30 sites combined between California and Washington, and 51 sites as control sites. And notice that in each case, albeit on a crash per mile basis, crashes went down. ADT actually went up. So one of the things that's often is pointed to as a reason not to do road diet is, traffic is going to be constrained. We're going to have Carmageddon. Don't even think about it. That's not really the case. So as a result of this, the summary table you see in front of you shows that in Iowa, for those 15 sites, they came up with a CMF of 0.53. And if you're not familiar with the CMF is a crash modification factor. And a crash modification factor less than 1 is a good thing, because really it equates to 1 minus that number as being the amount of reduction in crashes. So a CMF of 0.53 is the same thing as saying 1 minus 0.53, or a 47% reduction in crashes. So the CRF here is crash reduction factor, which you may see in the literature. So as a result of this, the recommendation in that HSIS summary report that I just showed you suggests that if the proposed site that you are analyzing seems to feel and look like the Iowa site, which has fairly moderate ADTs, small urban areas, maybe even getting into more rural nature, you might be able to choose the CMF of 0.53 as being a legitimate application. If your site is more closely resembles the suburban type facilities that were analyzed from California and Washington, maybe we prefer to be a bit more conservative and only claim about a 19% reduction. If neither one matches up, or you just don't want to wrestle with this, you could probably choose the 29%. These are not ideal numbers, but I think it does convey that there is important safety benefit from doing a road diet. And if we want to dig a little bit deeper here, and I encourage you to do this, you can go to the Crash Modification Clearinghouse, and I have the URL at the bottom of the slide here, and you can do a keyword search or a key phrase search on almost anything. And so for purposes of this exercise, that's what I actually did here. And so I did a keyword search on road diet. I got 30 results here. And you see first 4 here that are identified: converting 4-lane roadways to 3-lane roadways with a center turn lane. A few others that are worded about the same. And sometimes this may point to the same underlying research, sometimes an entirely different research. In this case, I delved a bit further into this very first one. So that's what you see highlighted here. And if you ponder this slide for a moment here, you may see something that seems familiar, and that is the 0.53 and the 47%. That sounds like the Iowa study. And sure enough, if this were a live slide I had in front of you, I could click on this right here, and it would take me to a summary of the underlying research. And I believe you click on this over here, it actually take you in many cases to a PDF version of the underlying research, so you can delve further into the weeds here. The other thing I want to emphasize is, and again, the idea of a road diet, I would like you to think of this as just a way to package a cross-section in a way that may be different from the way you would traditionally approach slicing and dicing a cross section. And by saying that, what I'm stressing is that really the benefit in terms of safety accrues from the independent decisions you make in terms of the metaphor I'm using here about ingredients. What might be the benefits of simply providing a two-way left turn lane? What might be the benefits in terms of the safety performance in terms of providing a bicycle lane, whether it's a shared lane, buffer separated, shared use path, whatever it might be. What's the benefit of putting a pedestrian refuge? So all these things may give you a bit more insights in terms of the potential safety benefits that could accrue from the project design that you are contemplating. So I'm going to pause again here, make sure that I'm not leaving anybody behind, or if there's a question that may have occurred.
Keith, we have several questions.
Okay.
Question from Michael. Would a traffic impact study be recommended prior to implementing a road diet?
I don't know whether it has to be done prior to, but I think traffic analysis is a critical component in terms of the feasibility approach to a road diet. So we can't look in the vacuum only at safety performance, as much as safety is, number one is a mission or vision statement in virtually every DOT in the country, including US DOT. We all realize that there are other factors that need to be weighed, and certainly traffic analysis plays into that.
Okay, next question is from Brad. He says, why is ADT used instead of peak hour traffic?
Actually, some of these rules of thumb, and again, I invite you to look at the Road Diet Info Guide to see some of the background material, come from some research that was done at the University of Kentucky. Did a pretty concerted analysis in terms of ADTs. They linked that to design hour volumes. They looked at certain combinations in terms of percentage of left turns to and from the main street, and came up with a pretty ambitious matrix and a graphic that kind of captures all of that. So having said that, I don't want to place anybody's mind that there is some, I'm sorry, 20,000 or 15,000, those thresholds, there's some hard and fast rule. There's not. It's really just kind of a first fairly crude filter to kind of say, for example, if we're 10,000 or less ADT, it's almost a no-brainer. That's kind of the low-hanging fruit, that the traffic operations aspect of this should not be a limiting factor. If you're 20,000 or above, you probably want to take a much closer look at the traffic implications. If you're between 10 and 20, it's just kind of a matter of judgment.
Okay, Keith, why don't we do one more question now, and then we can try to do a few more at the end. Question from Vina, who says, I know it is very few instances. What about going from a four-way stop to a roundabout? That's
a little bit off topic from road diets, but that's something certainly that can be considered. Again, the advantages to roundabouts, if you're not familiar, is that one of the biggest impacts in the roundabout design is it virtually eliminates the high severity T-bone right angle type crashes. It also is self-limiting in terms of forcing vehicles to slow as they enter the roundabout using deflection angles or whatnot.
Thanks, Keith. And I'll mention to the attendees that the Ohio 5th Annual Roundabouts Conference will be in September. So in the chat box, we have a link to the flyer for that.
Very good. All right, I see from my clock here, we're about 50 minutes from finishing up here. So I think I'm going to proceed to the case studies and share some additional resources and leave some time at the end for any other questions. They've been great questions up until now, so keep them coming. So let me just share a few case studies, and these come from a separate FHWA publication. I provide a link later on the slide set here. And I think there were probably 20 or so different case studies, and that was just a snapshot. We could have built a publication that was probably 200 pages long if we wanted to. And I just chose these as examples. I'm not in any way slighting any of the other case studies that appear there. So here's one from Northern Virginia, specifically from Reston. It's not too far outside of the Washington, D.C. metro area. And you see here the objective of the road diet was to reduce crashes and speeding. And so that's something you're probably going to see in many road diet implementations. They also wanted to improve both the safety and the connectivity for bicyclists. So presumably there was some observed bicycle use out there already, and perhaps there were some gaps in the existing bicycle network. And so the road diet also gave them the opportunity to work that in as well. The results were very good in terms of reducing crashes. And more specifically, it showed after a year's time, they had about an 80% drop in crashes. I don't know whether that's total crashes or severe and injury crashes. Vehicles traveling over 50 declined from 13% to 1%. So those high-end speeders were reduced. And again, thinking about the safe system approach and minimizing the kinetic energy in a crash is important. And here's a really intriguing thing. They actually were very outgoing and wanted to really gauge how well the community, stakeholders, were accepting of the road diet after the fact. So they surveyed 800 motorists, residents, cyclists, and here was the high points here. 69% said the road felt safer. Whether or not it was or not, even feeling safer is an important objective, I think. 47% said they cycled more. 69% said their car trips did not take any longer. And 74%, 3/4 of the respondents out of 850, said the project did in fact improve Lawyers Road. So I think that alone speaks volumes in terms of how a road diet can be implemented. Now, if we were to dig further into this case study, I would bet that we would discover that Virginia DOT was very careful to do a lot of outreach in advance of actually implementing the road diet. And that's something, again, that I would very strongly recommend that you do on any project, but a road diet in particular. Here's a study from Seattle, Washington, specifically Nickerson Street that runs along this Fremont Canal, posted at 30 miles per hour, a little bit longer than 1 mile here. And the concern was improving pedestrian safety, and also concern that 30 mile per hour speed limit was just viewed as advisory or totally ignored. And so as a result of implementing the Nickerson Street road diet, you see the before here had parking, 2 through lanes east direction. In the after condition, the parking remained 1 lane in each direction, 2-way left turn lane, and a shared lane for bicyclists. The top end speeder is defined by percent being 10 or more miles per hour over the speed limit, meaning 40 miles per hour or higher. It disappeared on me. I don't know why. Give me a second. Maybe my PowerPoint senses we're getting short on time as well. In any event, so we had about a 90% reduction in those top end speeders. I will fight with PowerPoint one more time. Somebody's winning, I'm not sure it's me. And I'm going to close here with a case study that was shared with me. I want to thank Ron Garcheski from our FHWA division office for sharing this with me. This comes from Oakwood, which I realize is a sort of a suburb of Dayton. And what they saw here was a reduction of 70% in crashes. You can just look at these graphics here about some of the components of this particular road diet. Notice they introduced that pedestrian refuge with the kind of angled crossing through here. You see that in this graphic as well. And here's the summary. So from crash database, looking at 3 years prior and 3 years post, showed a 66% reduction in crashes, which is huge. Vehicle speeds decreased by 6 to 11 miles per hour. That's also very significant. And best of all, there were no crashes involving pedestrians in the after condition. And the quote from the local head of public safety, which may be your term for head of the local police, road diet has produced exactly what it was designed to do, which is a safer roadway for the residents and anybody traveling through our community. So there are examples in Ohio. I know from having done a number of road diets there a couple of years ago that there are a lot of other examples that I probably could have found and shared with you. So please seize the opportunity to consider a road diet. And in order to do that, I do want to share a few more resources with you beyond your ability, obviously, to contact me with any follow-up questions that don't get answered today. But here's a series of documents. I keep mentioning this road diet info guide. That's what's pictured over here on the left. There's also the document from which I just excerpted those two studies from Virginia and Seattle, road diet case study document. And there's also a series of so-called Mythbusters. I believe they're all available from this URL on the bottom. And I think, I didn't test this, but the PDF handout that you were provided, I believe these should all be clickable hyperlinks. So the road diet info guide, and I wanted to share this with you, kind of mimics what we would be going through if I were to be doing an in-person day-long workshop with you. So I had to truncate this for obvious reasons, only have an hour total with you. Again, we would talk about why you consider a road diet. The important part here is it's feasible. And again, if you're trying to address something that is not really the focus of a road diet, you're trying to, let's say, deal with run off the road crashes in the traditional sense. I'm not saying that a road diet might not help, but that's probably not its best purpose. And some of the other feasibility determination factors might be availability of right-of-way. It might be percent heavy trucks. It might be presence of a transit system and the frequency of the stops. All those things need to be kind of melded into this, just like you could do sort of a feasibility approach on any type of project, whether you think of it kind of in a formal structured way like that or not. It's something that you really do have to do. And again, here's the case studies, and here are the states that are represented here. This is just a screenshot of some of the cities and states that were covered in this. And so these so-called Mythbuster Flyers are just 2 to 4 page handouts that are meant to very succinctly try to address some of these things that we think maybe are being misconstrued. Oftentimes you have the sense that if you introduce a road diet, it's going to make traffic worse. And I understand that. If I were a layperson not knowing better, you tell me I have 2 lanes east direction for through traffic, and now there's only going to be 1 lane east direction for true traffic. My common sense says to me, how can that possibly work without having total gridlock? Well, we know that it does work, and this attempts to deal with that. And there are several others here that get a little bit further into the weeds. Again, more resources that you may bring to bear. We have 2 videos that I wanted to bring to your attention. There is a road diet video that FHWA produced that's available at this link. I believe there's like a 5-minute version and maybe a 12-minute version. And so this kind of hits on some of the high points beyond just the safety benefits here. Another video here that I would suggest that you take the time to explore is this one that was produced by New Jersey DOT with backing from FHWA. And I was so impressed with this, I will make this statement. If during this hour you've been multitaskingly half paying attention, hope that's not the case, but I realize that may be some of you, no harm, no foul. If you look at this video, you really get a really strong sense of what a road diet potential could be. And so with that, I want to kind of make that sales pitch. And the last thing I will share with you here before I entertain questions is just over a month from now, you have a huge opportunity to participate in this so-called EDC Safety Summit series. Say that 3 times fast. Notice that on September 1st, there will be a presentation on STEP, Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian. So that'll get into things like a leading pedestrian interval and some of the things that are more focused on pedestrian accommodations to increase safety. September 8th, data-driven safety analysis. Anybody who's even touched the highway safety manual would understand the significance of that. September 15th, reducing rural roadway departures. That will touch upon the safety edge again, as well as the high friction surface treatment. On the 22nd, there's going to be a session on intersection and interchange geometrics. And we'll delve into all of the fairly novel intersection designs now, as well as some interchange geometry that goes with that. And on September 29th, lo and behold, there will be a session on road diets as well. These all run from 10 to 2 Eastern time. They're all free. And last time I checked, there were only about 100 people who had registered. So go ahead and take advantage of clicking on the URL at the bottom here and get yourself registered. And with that, we have about 6 or 7 minutes left here. I will entertain any additional questions or concerns. I apologize for kind of rushing through this. It's hard to kind of gauge the time and trying to get through the material without leaving anybody behind. So, Mike, any questions or comments that are now popping up there?
All right, yes, thanks, Keith. We have a question from Jeff who says, what studies have been done to support the claim that road diets provide lower and more uniform speeds?
There was a study that I included in one of my other workshops that comes from Virginia DOT, and it may or may not have been that Lawyers Road example, where they showed mean speeds before and after a 6-month period, I believe. That's the one that first comes to mind. So there may be others, but I just don't have them at that tip of my tongue right now.
All right, thanks. We have a question from Anthony. He says, what would minimum lane width be suggested for a 10,000 ADT facility with 5% trucks and target speed of 20 miles per hour? Bikes will share travel lane with vehicles.
I'm not going to weigh in on that because that really gets into the thick of the design considerations and having a full understanding of, first of all, what is the rationale behind lane width to begin with. Lane width, most people, when they ask what is standard lane width, they'll say 12 feet. When I follow up with a question, why, nobody has an answer. It's in part due to providing some freedom of maneuvering within that lane between lanes. It has some degree to do with drivers' feeling of speeds. So the Road Diet Info Guide provides a little bit of guidance on that, but really it comes down to the particular circumstance that you were dealing with. So I don't want to get into the situation where I'm offering up advice on specific project level activities.
Thanks, Keith. We have a question from Brian. Are there concerns about putting a bike lane next to parked cars, such as conflicts with bike and car doors as example?
Yeah, again, that's something that's more specific to the bike design, getting into those nuances. Certainly there was always the concern about the phenomenon called dooring, where a driver who opens his or her door may not be mindful of the fact that a bicyclist may be approaching and open the door just as the bicyclist is arriving. So there are ways to get around that. Sometimes the bike lane can be actually placed on the back side of the parking lane. There's still a possibility of dooring where the passenger may be opening the door, but that's certainly a concern. So what I will mention is that FHWA offers training on all of these components. So there's training that we offer on pedestrian facility design. There's specific training we offer now on bicycle design. So again, I'm not trying to be vague here, but I'm trying to be fair and not giving you some just speculation about what's an appropriate design in terms of a lane width or location of a bike lane. It really is very context specific to the project that you're looking at in terms of all those potential variables.
Thanks, Keith. We have a question from Craig, who says, do you know of any road diets that were maybe not a success, and were there any lessons learned?
Yes. There are a couple situations where, and I don't know the particular location right now, but the situation was the road diet was implemented in a situation where there really was not a problem. So they were actually creating a solution for something where the problem had not actually materialized. And so all they ended up doing was infuriating the local community, and they had to back it out. Now, again, what I think I mentioned earlier is there are ways in terms of implementing road diet where you can kind of test the waters. In fact, there are a couple of states, and Iowa might have been one of them, where they actually offered, for all intents and purposes, a money-back guarantee. If you allow us to install this road diet, we will, at our cost, come back in 6 months and put things back where they were, so to speak. So that's part of the messaging in terms of ensuring that the highway agency isn't doing things in a vacuum, that they are taking the stakeholders' values into consideration in approaching this.
Thanks, Keith. And we are very close to 3 p.m. at this point.
Yes, we
Is
are.
it okay if people email additional questions to you?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, with that, we want to thank you so much for presenting today. Do you have anything else as closing comments?
I just want to say thank you to you and to Victoria Beale for inviting me to present. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to share this as another tool in your toolbox. And like anything else, it has its place and it has its advantages and disadvantages. And hopefully I've provided you some resources to delve further into the possibility in using that tool. And so again, please look for opportunities in your daily business to try to enhance the safety for all of our road users, because I think all of us really want to see that vision zero come to fruition where we're not having to talk about these statistics anymore.
All right. Well, thanks again, Keith, so much for presenting. And thanks, everybody, for your participation today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks much.